Stan Piper. I sign as J. Stan Piper. I was raised in Paducah, Texas, born in '51. I've been surveying for 51 years this last June. So I've been surveying. I surveyed about 10 years in Lubbock and the last 40 years in Odessa and Midland. And you asked for me to explain the changes in technology that I have seen during my process as a surveyor. And I think a lot of people think GPS or computers is the biggest change that we have seen in technology. To me, the biggest change that I've seen in technology was the handheld calculator, because we could do calculations in the field. We could do, even later we used them as stored data, as a data collector on HP 48s. So I think sometimes people forget of, when I started it was all pencil and paper and trig tables and longhand calculations or a slide rule. There was a expensive manual calculator called a Curly calculator, but I never had one. I remember one of the first summers we used a calculator. It was just a 4-function calculator, and luckily I had a engineering student that had one, and we took it to the field and we'd be doing curve calculations and stuff, and I'd have the trig tables and I'd look up the trig functions and he'd put them in the calculator, and we worked everything together, and it was a good learning experience for me. Later I worked about 35 years with him as an engineer and me as a surveyor out of Midland. So relationships always mean a lot in life, and also it means a lot in surveying. So I do remember that when I first started, we had just a dumpy levels and a transit. In fact, when I first started working for Hugo Reed in 1970, all he had was a transit. When he shot a topo, he just used his transit and leveled the level vial underneath the scope and shot it with his transit. It was an American style transit. Hugo had problems with his eyesight, and his old transit always had real thick crosshairs. It is probably one of the first transits I ever ran. It wasn't a great transit, but it worked for him. Hugo was here in Lubbock, and he had a niche in the market at that time. He did mostly house plats, lot surveys, and subdivision plats. And the other surveyors here like doing farming, ranch, and construction staking, and he pretty much didn't do any of that. He did just subdivision plats, lot surveys, house plats, and he had a niche with all the title companies because he had such a quick turnaround on improvement surveys. And the reason I came to work for him, I came to Texas Tech and needed a part-time job to give me some spending money, mainly because my parents paid my room and board and they had paid my tuition, but they expected me to pay my spending money. And typically when I first started working for him, it would work about 20 hours a week, and he was paying me $1.80 an hour, which was minimum wage. So it wasn't a lot of money. And I remember one time he got on to me about I wouldn't cash my checks because I had cash and I didn't need them, and I didn't have a checking account in Lubbock, so I just kept the checks, and I figured I could cash them anytime I needed the money. So I worked for Hugo himself for about 3 or 4 years. He had problems with going through a divorce, became disenchanted with surveying. And at the time I was working with a guy that got registered at Hugo Reed. He'd worked for him for several years, named Tommy Anderson. And I worked in Tommy's crew a lot. And I was when I went to work for Hugo, he had himself and 2 employees, and I was the 3rd employee, so it was a pretty small operation. His office is located out at 98th and Elgin in a little barn kind of office beside his house, and he had animals, and he would ask me to take care of them. He was spent some time in Europe the first two summers I worked for him, and I would take care of his animals. In fact, that's really what he interviewed me about when I went to work for him. I started learning how to, do chaining and running the instrument. And the second summer I lived in Lubbock, I lived by myself in a small alley apartment, and all I had was a radio, didn't have a TV. And of course, didn't have enough money to go to the picture shows every night, so Tommy gave me a book on surveying. Tommy Anderson gave me a book on surveying. Basically, it was a textbook, and I sat down that summer for something to do at night and studied that textbook and learned how to do a lot of the manual calculations and running levels and how to read a vernier and how things were done. And the funny thing about all this is my uncle had been a surveyor, as a county surveyor, and as a LSLS, and my grandfather had been a county surveyor. So my family was had a background, but I'd never really worked for him. I'd measured some acreage out on the farm, doing allotments and stuff, but never had really asked, run a official land survey type stuff. We just measured off acreage. But as I went to work for Hugo, I know in some ways he always appreciated me, I think, because I had a background of working and being involved. I'd worked from a young age. I was responsible. I would show up, and I got along well with Hugo for the few years that he was there. And then I went to work in 70, and about 73 or 73, I think, he kind of backed out of it and quit being at work every day. And I started running the crew, and he doubled my wages more or less when I became involved in running a crew for him. And I worked all the way through school and graduated in December of 1974 from Tech with a degree in animal science, which isn't a very applicable degree for a surveyor. But there was certain classes that always have helped me. We had business classes, we had technical writing, we had business law, and all that. In fact, a deed is nothing but a contract between a buyer and a seller, so in some ways it was good education. I did take drafting while I was going to college at Tech, and after I got out with a degree, I went back and took Fortran programming. But college, I think, is important in surveying or any business really, and sometimes it's good to have the correct degree, but it's always good to have education no matter what it is. So after I graduated from college, and I've been running the crew a couple of years just part-time, did some subdivision staking, did a little construction, did lots of lot surveys. Tommy said, if you'll stay here for a year, I'll raise you to $5 an hour if you'll stay for a year. And this is back when I think you could still buy a chicken fry for under $2, chicken fried steak for under $2, so it was a reasonable wage. I could have went back to the farm and worked, but I thought, you could go back and work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, or you can stay in Lubbock and you can go to party any night you want to and have a good time. So in some ways, that small decision changed a lot probably on how my life turned out. And during that year, I started dating my wife, and as things, things went on, we bought more equipment, and that's one of the things was probably odd about me. I always wanted to, I even did this when I was farming with my dad. I'd have my own wrenches. It's not a big expense, but it's nice to know that you have your wrenches and your equipment. So when I started surveying, I remember the first year I was there, that year in '75, I bought a Transit. It was a Elite Transit. It was a Japanese-made instrument, but instead of having a silver plates on it, it had glass plates, and it had a fixed magnifier on the verniers, and it was really a nice little instrument. And I think I paid under $1,000 for it. But I ended up buying a tape, and then about a year later or so, I bought a level, and it's because I just wanted my equipment, my tools, and later they would pay me a stipend more or less for having my own equipment. But early on, I started, even before I was registered, I had some of my own equipment. And then after I got married and we moved to a house, and my wife was pregnant, I made the application for examination. And in this point in time, it was a 16-hour exam. It was 2 back-to-back days. There wasn't the SIT and the other. So with my pregnant wife, we went to Austin, and I took the test and luckily passed all 16 hours of it. It was in 2 days, 2 8-hour settings, or it was really 4 4-hour sections because they'd break for lunch. But that was probably a big turn in my life. And I will say that I had some good experience, and I had some good mentors in that process. And I think I've already told you about Hugo Reed and Tommy Anderson. I also had another employer named Bob Gay. He taught me some stuff. And I guess one of the biggest emphasis early in my career was C.A. Tubbs. He was an old surveyor. He was born in Lubbock in 1906, I believe. And he was in the first class at Texas Tech. He was an engineering student. Ended up being a PE, professional engineer, RPLS and LS. And he ran a small operation, and at times in that year that I was making that $5 an hour, Tommy and them would let him borrow me for a day for being a head chairman. And we did some pipeline work, mainly waterline work. And then later he came to work for us. And it was always odd because when he came to work for us, he was in his 70s, still doing his own drafting, still running his own crew. And he just liked it. I remember he's a little guy and he smoked a pipe. But when he came to work for us, I was in charge of the field crews. And it was partially because I was the full-time employee, but part of it, you know, you had to organize the people and who's going with who and what equipment you was taking. And because he was doing field work, he was really under my supervision. And it was always, to me, it was, Mr. Tubbs, would you mind going doing this? He said, sure, that's what you need. So he taught me a lot about the history of surveying, especially around Lubbock. He had a lot of friends. He'd been here a long time. He'd originally worked for Sylvan Sanders, which was his brother-in-law. And the other person that was really an early influence on me was Johnny Wilson. Originally it was Sprouls and Wilson, and later Wilson Surveying. And he was the proprietor over there, and we had a pretty open relationship between Hugo Reed and Wilson Surveying. They controlled about 70 or 80% of the surveying in Lubbock. And we'd go over and check their records to see if they'd done something or get some information, and they was always produced whatever they could to help us, and we'd do the same for them. So I know Johnny would probably have hired me, but he probably thought that it wasn't correct to try to hire somebody working for somebody else. At that point in time, we were all pretty ethical. There wasn't any. And I remember when we'd get a call from one of the other surveyors' clients, who we knew that they'd been a client of theirs, we would call them and ask them if if there was any problems. And many times the answer was, well, they haven't paid their bill, so I won't work for them. And they said, well, we won't work for them either until they pay your bill. And it was just the right way to do things. So I got started in surveying, and I was raised on a farm and a ranch, so Hugo's operation was pretty much lot and block type work in town. Some small tracts out in the Midland County and a few adjoining counties. But as I got more involved, I will say that Tommy had lots of connections. Tommy Anderson had lots of connections, so we'd always get jobs further out, and I would do a lot of those. Did some ranch surveys. With my background at Paducah, we got surveys at Paducah to do, so I got more involved in doing, and that's one reason I guess I went ahead, and because my uncle and Cobby had been LSs, I went ahead and took the LS exam. Between the RPLS in 78 and the LS in 80 or 81, I took New Mexico exam in 79. And that opened up a lot of studying about public land states and the additional deals. So I kept, that's pretty quick. Now they won't hardly let you take the LS within 2 or 3 years. They want you to have 3 or 4 years of experience before you take the LS. But LS I took was an 8-hour test, and it was pretty much just a written. I remember I wrote page after page after page. And the funny thing, I took it with somebody else that had been influential in me. When I studied for the RPLS originally in 78, I told you about Johnny Wilson running the competition. He had hired a guy named Robert Pounds. And Robert and me ended up taking our RPLS test and our LS test at the same time. And Robert was trained by the Army and was a real good mathematician, and he'd run, you know, mostly what I'd been around is transits and a few theodolites, but he'd run T2s and T3s, and he'd done a lot of control work. And his calculations were great. He helped me a lot. I remember it was before he had remarried, and he had his 2 children with him, and he ended up marrying Johnny Wilson's sister-in-law while she was working at Wilson Surveying, and he was working there. And they got together, and she had her 2 children, and he had his 2 children, and they later had a child between them. But anyway, that's a side story, I guess, an off subject. But because of his background, he taught me so much about doing calculations. He's the one that started teaching me to run calculations by azimuths instead of bearings, because you can write pretty simple programs using azimuths and distances and count closures. And it was really nice. And you could take a theodolite that, you know, theodolite only turns angles to the right. It won't turn an angle to the left. And you can set an azimuth on the backside, and then you can read azimuths the rest of the way around, and it's a really quick way to calculate coordinates. And like I said, we was doing all this with a calculator in the field. At first we used HP 45s primarily, and later HP 25s, and it just went on and on. It was like every time a new calculator came out, we thought we had to try to get it. And I remember back in the period of time where I was making that $5 or $6 or $8 an hour, a HP 45 calculator was $245. It had been $400 and something when it first came out. So technology is always expensive at first. So Tommy helped me a lot, but he sent me to San Angelo in 1980, in the spring of 1980, to do a subdivision and open a branch office. And the subdivision didn't go very well. They had problems with the city, and I kept having to go to Midland to do lot surveys to have something to do. And I had a couple of engineering companies that needed surveying work to supplement their design and layout and stuff that they really didn't want to do surveying on their own, or they wouldn't turn to do it. One of them had one crew, but that's all, and they had a great big subdivision to do, and Park Hill, Smith and Cooper was the other one, and they had several other projects, plus a great big airport project. I tried to get Tommy for us to move the Hugo Reed office to Midland. In fact, I'd talked to him previously in the year before that about doing that, and he had never decided to do it. And so finally I took a personal day and went to Lubbock, or to Midland, and talked to both of those companies and asked them if they cared if Hugo Reed showed up or I showed up. And they said, we don't care if you've got the equipment and you can have help and you can do the work. So I decided that I would go into private practice. So I went back to San Angelo, where we was living in an apartment. We had a house in Lubbock, and told my wife, well, we're moving to Midland. So she'd never hardly been to Midland. I think she'd been there one time, and she was 9 months pregnant. I took a week off between being employed at Hugo Reed and being self-employed, and I had my son on that Monday induced. So we stayed there for that week, and my sister-in-law came and picked up my wife and child, and they went back to Paducah, where I was raised and where her sister lived. And I came to Odessa, Midland area, and started running the office. The guy that Dow Kelly was with me in San Angelo, and he came with me. We stopped with Hugo Reed and started with me. I remember I paid to have his trailer house moved from San Angelo to Midland, and we started the company with 2 people, and I was running the crew and he was running the instrument. I do remember that it only took us about 3 or 4 months that we had so much work to do. I bought another instrument, another pickup, and started running 2 crews because we could find some hands just to, chain and stuff. So I guess I would say, I borrowed a little bit of money to start a company, but I borrowed enough I had to buy a trailer house to have a place to live, really. I couldn't, when you start a company, you can't really ask for financing on a house or something without a lot of collateral, and I didn't have a lot of collateral. But finally, we moved down there and started, and it was good for the first 2 or 3 years for sure, and paid off all of our debt on our equipment. I guess I ought to talk about the equipment I bought to go into practice. When I went into business, I didn't have a distance meter, a EDM, and I bought an EDM, and it was $8,000, and we was getting field crew rates were, I remember my first 2 field crew rates. A 3-man crew was $55 an hour, and a 2-man crew was $45 an hour. So a $8,000 investment for an EDM was a pretty sizable investment. And the second thing that I bought was a computer. It was a HP 85, and I found a used one that was only for $3,000. It had a 4-inch diagonal LED screen. LED, yeah, it's a LED, and a 4-inch thermal printer. Maybe it was a 5-inch screen and a 4-inch, because it's about the same size. And it had a tape drive for memory storage. It was pretty much basic, all in one, and that's how we got started. And I had a drafting table I'd previously bought, and the smallest bedroom in that mobile home, it was a 14-foot wide mobile home, was my first office. We had a desk in it and a drafting table, and that was the whole office. Field crews showed up, and all the drafting and field work, office work was done at night. And my wife, of course, did the bookkeeping. So we struggled some getting through that, but really in the first two years we had all of our stuff paid off. And then the late 80s, things slowed down. And I had a friend, old Johnny Wilson, that ran the competition in Lubbock, put in a good word for me, and I got some contract work for Texaco, and that helped me get through the late 80s. And we got a big job on a bunch of patent surveys for 3 ranches, and that helped a lot too. That was from the Parker Estates. We did one in Ector County and 2 of those in Andrews County, and each one of them was about 20,000 acres, and about 3/4 of it had to be patented or corrected field notes written, and we did all that. So Dow worked for me from the start in '81. He worked for me until the middle '90s, when he decided he was going to go to Amarillo, and he's tried to come back and talk to me a time or two, and I probably should have hired him back, but I didn't. And he's operates his own company and has worked for other engineering companies and stuff. So Dow has always been a good friend of mine. He's, I guess, one thing I thought about talking about, you know, family's somewhat knowingly hard to work with, and sometimes the same can be said with friends. And I think as an employer and a boss, you have to somewhat separate yourself from the employees, but you can still be friendly with them and have conversation, but you still, it's kind of like being I thought about this in the last few days, it's kind of like the difference between being an officer and an enlisted person. You've got to have that you're the boss, that you say what goes on. That doesn't mean that you can be abusive and scream or holler, but you got to understand that you're the one that's on the line to get the job done. You're the one that's going to sign your name. You're the one that's responsible for doing the work. So I've been in Midland, Odessa area. This November it'll be 40 years. And it's been an experience. I doubt there's a half a dozen days that I've really dreaded going to work. I enjoy what I do. I think it's important. I think I've made a lot of friends, people that I work for, and it's always nice to work with somebody that respects you and, you know, and appreciates what you do for it. So this thing wants you to talk about some of your best projects. Some of the best projects I've worked on have been patent surveys, ranch surveys, and stuff like that. And sometimes it ends up being also some of the hardest to get things done because you have to get approval from the land office. And that sometimes can be drug out over, if not at least weeks, if not months, and sometimes even years. And that's one of my biggest complaint is that you can't get, I see the old surveyors in the correspondence files that they would write almost, sometimes I've seen it even on telegraph. They'd telegraph the land office and ask questions, and the responses would be very quickly, in a few days they would get them back. And I can't believe that with all the technology we've got, the supervision or the checking of stuff, it takes so long. I think that's one of the worst things about surveying is, and your clients never understand that. It's just the hardest thing about it. One other person or 2 other persons I've got to talk about. I'm going to talk about one of them. This will be an interesting topic, I think. I've done jobs with W.C. Wilson out of San Angelo. He was a consultant for Texaco, and I do the field work. And I think that was important to me because I was around him and I learned his integrity and what he did. But that didn't mean that I always agreed with him, because some other times I would do things that the way he wouldn't have done it. because you've got to be your own self. You've got to answer to what you think is right and what's correct. And I always think about what I want my solution, my construction, my survey to be what would prevail in district court if it was ever taken to court. There's always appeals court and Supreme Court, but so many times the facts finding portion of a court case is district court. And usually district court, it can be a bench trial or a jury trial, and I've testified in front of both. And I think that is the best test to a surveyor's ability and knowledge is how he can do a job that will stand up to a court test. And you learn a lot because Texas law is so much common law and there are so many court cases involved. And one of the questions on here is what it takes to be a good surveyor. I think first you have to be a good person, and you have to you have to be able to stand up for what you think's right. You have to do what you say you will do. Contracts many times are a handshake or a short, email. So you try at best you can to do what you say you will do. I won't say that I've always been able to accomplish that, but you have to try. And I think it takes a lot of history. You have to know the history of the land. You have to know the problems of how it was surveyed, how the original surveys were done, how corrected surveys were done, how it affected the property. Subdivisions, are important part of surveying, but it's just a knowledge of math, a knowledge of law, and you have to have a good ethics, and you have to be willing to work really hard. And sometimes it's about what you've known in the past. Can you bring it forward? I've had people call me and want me to do a survey in an area which I know is messed up, and I know that they're trying to get a result that I will not probably agree with. And then several times I've told them, I said, I don't think it's a good deal because what you want and what I think is correct is not the same thing, and I would turn the jobs down. It's not happened a lot, but sometimes they'll be shopping looking for somebody and they'll have their own conclusion of what they want. I just don't agree with that. The other surveyor that I really learned a lot from was A.B. Kelly, and not hardly anybody knows much about A.B. anymore. He worked for Exxon, and he did mainly a lot of their research and report writing and working sketches. And I won't say that I learned how to construct surveys from him. I did learn an awful lot of how to research and how to prepare and be ready to go to the field. And I do know that he did a good bit of field work early in his life, but when I knew him, he was mainly doing reports and working sketches and stuff like that. At Exxon was kind of unique in that their surveying department always submitted all their detail maps to their law department, and their law department would pretty much come up with what they thought the construction should be. So I always thought that some of the Exxon surveyors were really good surveyors, but as far as their construction, because they had not been experienced much in it, their legal department took care of that. And I thought sometimes they were weak in their construction, but I've done a lot of contract work for Exxon. I did contract work for Texaco, Chevron, and Mobil back in the early 80s, 90s. So is important. At the land office, I've been through several different generations of survey directors there, and although sometimes they've been aggravation, they're also a lot of background because they handle so much location of surveys and lots of different to the country. So one of the things I would like to talk about is all the young people, and some of them aren't so young anymore, that I've been able to help and teach. When I was first at Hugo Reed, we had a lot of engineering students and other people that wanted to get a start in surveying, and because I was kind of the full-time running the field parties, it was laid to me to help them and put out those crews. And I have taught a lot of people how to do calculations and grades and stake curves and stuff like that. And you know, it's always felt good. In fact, we had classes at night down there that the employees would attend, and I would try to teach them how to take notes and do stuff. And I won't say that I'm the best teacher by any means, but I felt quite rewarded that many of them went on to be registered surveyors and good surveyors. And then later in about 2010, Odessa College got our program started, and I helped start that. And as a professor, ad hoc professor, I taught classes at least 3 or 4 times there. And I taught one of the first classes we taught was Legal Principles 1 and 2. And I only had a class of 7 or 8 people. A couple of them were even registered surveyors. And I enjoyed that, and the rest of those young people that were there are now registered surveyors, nearly every one of them. So I got tickled at one of them, and she still's a surveyor there in Midland, Jennifer Ward, and she went to take her test, and she said, I got the test, and I laid it out, and I started reading it, and she said, this is exactly what Stan taught us in class. And she come back to me, how did you know what was be on that test? I said, it wasn't hard. They teach it, they take the test out of Decisions, which is a book that Ken Gold wrote, and I taught straight out of that book. So if you teach the book that the test is prepared out of, it's not a problem. And she had to admit that, and most of all those people pretty much passed the test their first time. So it's one of the greatest accomplishments that I think I've done. I've supported and TSPS for many years. In fact, it was first TSA. And I was on the board of directors and program chairman. We had a short course or an annual meeting in Lubbock in 1988. In fact, my youngest daughter was probably conceived at that convention. I did the program, and I got elected to the board of directors at that meeting. I remember it was a good point in my life. Me and Tommy Anderson kind of had a falling out over me leaving him and starting my own company, and we kind of patched things up about that period of time. And it maybe was never the same, but I think we have both understood that there was things that we needed to do and we did do. So sometimes things are hard, but sometimes you figure out how to do them without getting mad. I'd like to talk a little bit about the mentality that it takes to being a surveyor. You have to be willing to come up with a construction and stand behind it in a location. And you don't always please everybody. You don't get mad at them. And many surveyors, even knowing the same facts, will come up with a different solution for a survey. And I think it's important that you understand that a survey is based on a professional opinion and what your knowledge is, and it should be based on the facts, and you should discover all the facts that you can in the field and in the record. So it's important to do all that, but not necessarily will you have the same answer. So that doesn't mean that you can't speak to the man. You can't, it's not personal. It's a professional disagreement or a difference of opinion. So I think everybody should try to get along in surveying and understand and I know that me and W.C. Wilson that I talked about earlier, we had differences of opinion on how to do things. And in fact, we went to one of the biggest surveys I ever did, went to trial. It was over a lawsuit about some gas wells. And there were several $1 million on the line, and it was a bench trial, and the judge allowed each of us to sit in and hear the other person's testimony and all the proceedings of the court. And at the end of the day, if somebody needed help taking out their exhibits, we'd carry out the other fellow's exhibits, because it wasn't about if we were disagreed. It was that they were both professionals and we both, respected each other. That's always the thing about being professional, is trying to get along, and in life, I refereed soccer for many years, and sometimes I think that prepares you to be cross-examined in trials. There's a lot of pressure put on you in depositions and in trial, being questioned and but you just got to just keep your cool and do what's correct and right. Let me think a minute. Here's one other thing I want to talk, and it's pretty much on this subject. You as a surveyor are supposed to be surveying not to better what your client's going to get. You're surveying for the public. In fact, I was first registered as a registered public surveyor. It was a name that it's passed under the 1955 bill. And then you're trying to put the good of the public first. Now, you have to represent your client in some things, and you have to do what's right, but your first charge is to do surveying what is best for the general public and what is correct. I guess I'd like to say something about studying for the RPLS test. Besides decisions, which I brought up, there's a lot of good articles in the old bound short course books, and they're a great source of information. Sometimes forgotten, but we do even, and I would say this, I think taking classes, continuing education classes or other classes, education is always good quality, and I think if you really want to learn something well, try to teach it. But it's also good to take the classes. So I'll speak highly for continuing education. I think TSPS tries to do a good job on their education, and I think it's important. And I've talked about a lot of surveyors during this, and I would say that trying to get to know other surveyors and building the camaraderie that you can have, you can learn a lot from just discussing things with people. I think that's one of the things that the COVID deal has really stopped us meeting, stopped us discussing things personally. Of course, we've had a lot of online meetings, but I think person-to-person discussions, and you can always learn something from somebody else. Makes me think of at a time that we had a poor person came to work for Hugo Reed, and he wasn't a very good person, and he wasn't a very good hand really, but he taught us one thing: how to do up a plumb bob. He had learned that, and you can tie a string and slip it, and you can learn something from everybody. It may not be the best. You may learn what's wrong, because learning what's wrong is sometimes is as important as learning what's right, because you've got to know the difference.